Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched the screens with growing concern. The sensors were showing something impossible. Thousands of ships were appearing at the edge of the solar system, where nothing should exist. He had served in the Earth Defense Fleet for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. The communications officer turned to him with fear in her eyes and reported that all outer colonies had gone silent within the last hour. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he gave the order to sound the alarm across all human space. The year was 2287, and humanity had spread across 12 star systems. Earth was the heart of civilization, with billions of people living in massive cities that stretched toward the sky. The colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter were thriving centers of research and industry. Everything had been peaceful for decades, and most people believed that humanity was alone in the universe. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The alien ships moved with terrifying speed. They were unlike anything human engineers had designed, with surfaces that seemed to shift and change like liquid metal. Within hours, the first attacks began. The colony on Europa sent a desperate transmission, showing their defensive satellites being torn apart by weapons that dissolved metal and flesh alike. Then the transmission cut to static. Jake ordered the fleet to battle stations, but he knew they were facing something far beyond their capabilities. Dr. Lisa Martinez was working in her laboratory on Mars when the attack. Warnings blared through the research complex. She was a quantum physicist who had spent years studying theoretical weapons systems. Her current project, called Phoenix Protocol, was designed to disrupt enemy communications using quantum field manipulation, but it existed only on paper and computer simulations. She grabbed her data files and rushed toward the evacuation shuttles as explosions rocked the facility. Through the windows, she could see the alien ships descending like a swarm of insects blocking out the sun. The Battle of Earth began 3 days after the first contact. The aliens had destroyed every outer colony and now surrounded the homeworld with thousands of ships. Jake Harrison led the Valiant into combat alongside hundreds of other Earth defense vessels. They fired everything they had, but their weapons barely scratched the alien hulls. The enemy responded with beams of energy that cut through the human ships like paper. Jake watched in horror as the destroyer Newton exploded next to him, taking 500 crew members into the void. On the ground, Captain Greg Stone led his Marine unit through the ruins of New York City. The aliens had begun landing ground forces, and the fighting was brutal. The enemy soldiers moved in perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single mind. Greg rallied his troops, and they managed to destroy several alien units using explosives and heavy weapons. But for every enemy they killed, 10 more appeared. He received orders to fall back to the evacuation points and protect the civilian transports. Amy Chen was one of the best fighter pilots in the fleet, with more combat hours than anyone her age. She flew her craft through the chaos of orbital combat, dodging enemy fire and destroying alien drones with precise shots. Her squadron had started with 20 fighters, but now only 5 remained. She heard Jake Harrison's voice over the radio ordering all pilots to cover the evacuation ships. Amy knew this meant they were abandoning Earth, but she understood there was no other choice. The civilian transports were massive ships designed to carry thousands of people. They were slow and defenseless, which made them easy targets. Jake Harrison positioned the Valiant and the remaining warships between the transports and the alien fleet. He knew this was a suicide mission, but if they could buy enough time, thousands of lives might be saved. The aliens seemed to sense the humans were retreating and pressed their attack with renewed fury. Dr. Martinez made it aboard one of the transports, clutching her data files like they were made of gold. Around her, families huddled together, crying and praying. Children asked where they were going, and parents had no answers. Through the viewport, Lisa could see the Valiant taking hit after hit while holding the line. The ship was burning and pieces were breaking off, but still it fought. She felt tears running down her face as she realized how many were dying to save them. Greg Stone was among the last Marines to board the transports. His armor was scorched and dented, and half his unit was dead. As the transport lifted off, he looked down at Earth for what he knew might be the last time. The cities were burning. The oceans reflected the orange glow of countless fires. The planet that had given birth to humanity was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The moment came when Jake Harrison had to make the hardest decision of his life. The Valiant was critically damaged and could not sustain much more punishment. If they stayed any longer, the evacuation ships would be caught and destroyed. He gave the order to retreat. The remaining warships broke off from combat and jumped to faster-than-light speed, following the transports toward the outer territories. Behind them, the alien swarm descended on Earth like a plague. Amy Chen was one of the last fighters to dock with the fleet carriers before the jump. Her fuel was nearly empty and her weapons were spent. As her craft settled into the hangar bay, she removed her helmet and saw other pilots crying. Some were screaming in rage while others sat in stunned silence. They had failed to protect their home and the guilt was overwhelming. Theo. Fleet regrouped at a navigation point far from Earth. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the damaged Valiant and looked at the tactical display. They had saved approximately 50,000 people from Earth and the various colonies. 50,000 out of billions. The scale of the loss was incomprehensible, but those 50,000 were alive, and that meant humanity still had a chance. Director Paul Webb had been coordinating the defense from a command bunker in Geneva when the city was hit. He barely made it to a transport and now stood beside Jake on the bridge. The two men looked at each other with the weight of failure heavy on their shoulders. Paul asked what they should do now, and Jake replied that they would regroup and gather every survivor they could find. They would learn about this enemy and they would find a way to fight back. The survivors jumped to a remote mining colony called New Haven in the Kepler system. It was far from the core worlds and hopefully beneath the notice of the alien swarm. As the battered fleet limped into orbit, Jake Harrison addressed all the ships over the communication network. He told them that Earth had fallen but humanity had not. They had been knocked down but they would get back up. This was not the end but rather the beginning of their true fight. As long as one human drew breath, the war would continue. Dr. Martinez listened to the speech from her quarters on the transport. She opened her data files and began reviewing the Phoenix Protocol research. If humanity was going to fight back, they would need weapons that could match the alien technology. She had the theoretical framework, but turning theory into reality would require resources and time that they might not have. Still, she had to try because the alternative was extinction. That night, Jake Harrison did not sleep. He stood alone in his quarters looking at pictures of Earth from before the invasion. Beautiful blue oceans and green continents teeming with life. His sister had lived in Chicago and he had no idea if she had survived. Probably not. He clenched his fists and made a silent promise to everyone who had died. Their sacrifice would not be in vain. Humanity would survive and somehow they would make the aliens pay for what they had done. 6 months had passed since Earth fell, and the survivors had turned New Haven into a military base. The mining colony had been home to only a few thousand workers, but now housed 50,000 refugees and the remnants of the Earth Defense Fleet. Jake Harrison had set up his command center in the old mining administration building and spent his days coordinating rescue missions and gathering intelligence. Ships arrived almost daily, bringing survivors who had been hiding in remote stations and asteroid bases. Each new arrival brought stories of horror and loss, but also valuable information about the enemy. Dr. Lisa Martinez had commandeered one of the mining facility laboratories and worked around the clock studying the alien technology. The fleet had managed to recover several destroyed enemy drones from battle sites, and Lisa dissected them piece by piece. What she discovered both fascinated and terrified her. The aliens operated on a hive mind system, where individual units had no independent thought. They were controlled by massive command ships that the survivors had started calling Nexus vessels. If they could disrupt the connection between the Nexus ships and the drones, they might have a fighting chance. Lieutenant Ben Cooper was a young officer who had barely escaped when his colony was attacked. He had witnessed the enemy tactics firsthand and brought detailed observations to Jake Harrison. Ben described how the aliens moved in perfect formation and responded to threats with inhuman precision. But he also noted that when communication was disrupted during solar flares, the drones seemed confused and easier to destroy. This information proved valuable to Lisa's research. Kate Morrison had worked as an intelligence analyst before the invasion and now used her skills to intercept and decode alien transmissions. She sat in a cramped room filled with computer equipment, wearing headphones and listening to the strange signals the enemy broadcast. Most of it was incomprehensible, but occasionally she caught patterns that seemed like orders or status reports. She was slowly building a database that might help predict enemy movements. Chief Engineer Danny Price was responsible for keeping the human fleet operational, and it was an impossible task. The ships had been damaged in the retreat from Earth, and spare parts were scarce. Danny and his team worked miracles with whatever materials they could salvage from the mining equipment. They stripped down cargo haulers for hull plating and modified mining lasers into makeshift weapons. The fleet was held together with determination and improvisation, but somehow it stayed functional. Jake Harrison called a meeting of his senior staff to discuss their situation. They gathered around a table in the command center and the mood was grim. Paul Webb reported that they had located approximately 200,000 survivors, scattered across dozens of hiding spots throughout human space. It was a tiny fraction of the billions who had died, but it was something. Lisa Martinez presented her findings about the Hive mind system and explained that destroying Nexus vessels might cripple entire sections of the enemy fleet. The conversation turned to the Phoenix Protocol, and Lisa explained what would be needed to make it work. The weapon required an exotic element called neutronium-9, which existed only in the cores of collapsing neutron stars. There was one such star system within reach, but it was deep in enemy territory. The mission would be incredibly dangerous with almost no chance of the crew returning alive. Jake looked around the table and asked who would volunteer. Every hand went up without hesitation. The next day brought unexpected hope. A small enemy patrol of 3 ships entered the New Haven system, apparently searching for human survivors. Jake Harrison saw an opportunity to test their defenses and learn more about enemy tactics. He ordered the mining lasers repositioned and had Danny Price set up a trap using the asteroid field that surrounded the colony. When the alien ships moved close, the humans struck. The battle was brief but intense. The mining lasers were powerful enough to cut through rock, and they proved effective against the alien hulls. Danny had rigged several old cargo containers with explosives and launched them into the enemy formation. The aliens tried to adapt, but the humans kept changing their tactics using unpredictability as a weapon. After 20 minutes of fighting, all 3 enemy ships were destroyed. It was humanity's first victory against the swarm, and the effect on morale was immediate. Amy Chen had survived the evacuation and now trained new pilots using the few fighters the fleet still possessed. When news of the victory spread through New Haven, she gathered her pilots and gave them hope. She told them that the enemy could be beaten and that every small victory brought them closer to taking back what was lost. Her passion was infectious and volunteers lined up to join the fighter corps. Greg Stone had been organizing the Marine forces and preparing them for ground combat. He knew that eventually they would need to board enemy ships or retake occupied colonies. The training was brutal because Greg understood that weakness meant death. His Marines practiced in the mining tunnels, learning to fight in close quarters against an enemy that never tired and never retreated. They developed new tactics using explosives and ambush strategies that might work against the hive mind drones. Jake Harrison reviewed the intelligence reports and made his decision. They would send a ship to retrieve the neutronium-9 from the neutron star system. He chose a small fast vessel called the Defiance and personally selected the crew. Lisa Martinez would go as scientific lead to ensure they collected the right materials. Amy Chen would pilot because she was the best they had. Greg Stone would handle security and Ben Cooper would navigate. Danny Price volunteered to keep the ship running no matter what happened. Kate Morrison would provide intelligence support and help them avoid enemy patrols. The crew of the Defiance spent 2 weeks preparing for the mission. They studied maps of enemy territory and memorized patrol patterns. Danny Price modified the ship's engines for maximum speed and installed stealth systems that might help them avoid detection. Lisa Martinez designed specialized drones that could harvest neutronium-9 from the star's accretion disk. Everyone knew the odds of success were slim, but nobody backed down. The night before departure, Jake Harrison addressed the crew in private. He thanked them for volunteering and told them that what they were doing might save the entire human race. If they succeeded, the Phoenix weapon could turn the tide of the war. If they failed, humanity would likely face extinction within a year. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but the crew accepted it willingly. Amy Chen spent her last evening on New Haven walking through the refugee sections. She saw children playing games and families trying to maintain some normalcy, despite everything they had lost. These people were depending on her and the others to bring back hope. She made a promise to herself that she would not let them down no matter what it cost. Greg Stone checked and rechecked his weapons until they gleamed. He had lost too many good Marines in the retreat from Earth, and the guilt still haunted him. This mission was a chance to strike back at the enemy and maybe find some redemption. He loaded his gear onto the Defiance and prepared himself mentally for what was coming. Ben Cooper was nervous but determined. He was young and inexperienced compared to the others, but Jake Harrison had faith in his abilities. Ben had studied the navigation routes obsessively and knew every shortcut and hiding spot along the way. He would get them there and back or die trying. Lisa Martinez sat alone with her research notes making last-minute calculations. The Phoenix Protocol was sound in theory, but she had never tested it in real conditions. Everything depended on getting the right amount of neutronium-9 and hoping her equations were correct. Science had always been about experimentation and verification, but now there was no room for error. She closed her eyes and ran through the formulas one more time. The morning came and the crew boarded the Defiance. A small crowd gathered to see them off, including many of the refugees who understood what this mission meant. Jake Harrison saluted from the command center as the ship powered up its engines. Amy Chen sat in the pilot seat and felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. She looked back at her crew and smiled. They were heading into the abyss, but they were doing it together. The Defiance launched from New Haven and accelerated toward the edge of the system. Within minutes, they jumped to faster than light speed, leaving safety behind. The mission had begun and there was no turning back. Somewhere ahead in enemy territory was the key to humanity's survival. All they had to do was reach it before the swarm destroyed them. The Defiance traveled through the darkness between stars using minimal power to avoid detection. The crew moved quietly through the corridors, speaking in whispers as if the enemy might hear them across the void. Amy Chen kept the ship on a course that avoided known patrol routes, but every hour brought them deeper into territory controlled by the swarm. The tension was constant and nobody slept well. They were a tiny spark of humanity moving through an ocean of hostile space. Ben Cooper monitored the navigation systems with obsessive focus. He had plotted their route to take advantage of nebula clouds and asteroid fields that might hide them from enemy sensors. Every time the ship changed course, he recalculated their arrival time at the neutron star system. They were making good progress, but the journey would still take 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hoping they stayed invisible. Dr. Lisa Martinez spent her time reviewing the data on neutronium-9 extraction. The material existed only in extreme conditions where gravity and radiation were intense enough to crush ordinary matter into exotic forms. Her harvesting drones would need to operate in an environment that would kill a human instantly. She ran simulations constantly looking for any flaw in her design, because there would be no second chances. Greg Stone kept his Marines ready for combat, even though they all knew that if the swarm found them, fighting would be pointless. The Defiance was a small ship with minimal weapons designed for speed rather than battle. Still, Greg insisted on weapons drills and practiced boarding procedures. He believed that discipline and preparation kept people focused and prevented them from dwelling on the danger. 2 weeks into the journey, they passed through a system that had once been home to a human colony. Kate Morrison picked up faint signals from the planet below and suggested they investigate. Jake Harrison had ordered them to avoid any detours, but Amy Chen argued they should at least scan for survivors. After a tense discussion, the crew agreed to a quick reconnaissance. They dropped out of faster than light speed and approached the planet carefully. What they found was devastating. The colony had housed 50,000 people, and now it was silent. The cities were intact but completely empty, as if the population had simply vanished. Orbital scans detected no life signs but showed massive structures the swarm had built around the planet. These structures were harvesting something from the atmosphere and sending it to ships in orbit. Kate Morrison analyzed the data and realized with horror that the aliens were processing the planet itself, breaking down the biological material for some unknown purpose. They picked up a weak distress signal coming from an asteroid base at the edge of the system. Ben Cooper plotted a course and Amy Chen brought the Defiance alongside the asteroid. Greg Stone led a team in environment suits to investigate. They found 43 survivors hiding in a mining facility that had been abandoned before the invasion. The survivors were in bad shape with dwindling food and air supplies. They had been hiding for months waiting for rescue that they thought would never come. The decision to rescue them complicated the mission. The Defiance was already cramped with 7 crew members, and adding 43 more would strain life support and slow them down. But leaving them to die was not something any of the crew could accept. Lisa Martinez recalculated their supplies and determined they could make it work if everyone rationed carefully. The survivors were brought aboard and the Defiance resumed its journey. Among the rescued was a woman named Claire Hayes, who had been the colony administrator. She told them about the invasion and how the swarm had arrived without warning. The aliens had used some kind of gas that paralyzed people without killing them. Then they had systematically collected every human on the planet and taken them away. Claire and the others had only survived because they were off-world when it happened. Her story confirmed what Lisa had suspected about the swarm's methods. The presence of the survivors changed the atmosphere on the ship. The rescued people were grateful but traumatized. Many had lost entire families and struggled with survivors' guilt. Amy Chen spent time with the children trying to give them some hope. Greg Stone organized the adults into work details to help maintain the ship. Keeping busy was the best way to prevent despair from taking hold. 3 weeks after leaving, New Haven the Defiance arrived at the neutron star system designated Hades 7. What they found was worse than expected. The star itself was surrounded by a massive swarm construction project. Dozens of ships were harvesting energy directly from the star's surface, feeding it into enormous collection arrays. At the center of the operation was a Nexus command ship, larger than anything the humans had encountered before. It was easily 5 times the size of the Valiant. The crew held an emergency meeting to reassess their options. The original plan had been to approach the star, quickly grab the Neutronium-9 and escape before being detected. That was impossible now with so many enemy ships present. Ben Cooper suggested using the rescued survivors' cargo hauler as a decoy. The hauler was still attached to the Defiance and could be rigged to broadcast false signals. If they could draw the swarm's attention away, they might have a chance. Danny Price proposed disguising the Defiance using pieces of destroyed swarm technology they had collected. The alien materials could be attached to the hull, making them appear like another enemy ship on sensors. It was risky because if the disguise failed, they would be instantly destroyed. But it was the only plan that had any chance of working. They spent 12 hours preparing. The cargo hauler was loaded with explosives and programmed to fly toward the Nexus ship, broadcasting emergency signals that Kate Morrison had constructed from captured enemy transmissions. The Defiance was covered in alien hull plating, and its energy signature was modified to match swarm vessels. Lisa Martinez prepared her harvesting drones and reviewed the extraction procedures one final time. The plan began when the cargo hauler launched toward the construction site. It broadcast distress signals claiming to be a damaged swarm ship requiring assistance. The enemy response was immediate. Dozens of ships broke off from their work and moved to intercept the hauler. The Defiance, using its disguise, slipped into the chaos and headed for the neutron star's accretion disk. Amy Chen piloted the ship with incredible precision, navigating through streams of superheated matter and intense radiation. The shields were barely holding and alarms blared constantly, but she kept them on course. Lisa Martinez deployed her drones and they descended into the disk where Neutronium-9 existed in stable pockets. The collection process would take 10 minutes, but they had to stay in position the entire time. The swarm detected the deception sooner than expected. The cargo hauler exploded, taking several enemy ships with it, but the Nexus vessel realized something was wrong. Enemy ships began converging on the Defiance's position. Greg Stone monitored the tactical display and watched their escape window closing. They needed 5 more minutes for the drones to complete collection. Ben Cooper was coordinating the extraction when a radiation surge from the star hit the Defiance. The shields failed in one section and superheated plasma flooded into the engineering compartment where Ben was working. He was caught in the blast and his suit was breached. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Amy Chen heard his screams over the radio and tried to reach him, but the radiation was too intense. Ben knew he was dying, but he still had a job to finish. He dragged himself to the drone control station and manually guided the remaining units to collect the last samples. His vision was fading and his hands were shaking, but he completed the sequence. The drones returned to the ship carrying precious containers of Neutronium-9. Ben Cooper transmitted a final message saying the mission was complete, then collapsed. Amy Chen reached him seconds later, but there was nothing she could do. He died in her arms, still smiling because he knew they had succeeded. The Nexus ship was moving toward them now and its weapons were charging. Danny Price pushed the engines beyond their design limits and the Defiance accelerated away from the star. They had the Neutronium-9, but they still had to escape the system. Enemy ships pursued firing weapons that tore through space. The Defiance's disguise was worthless now and they were running on pure speed. Amy Chen flew like never before, dodging incoming fire and using the debris from the construction site as cover. The ship took several hits and systems failed one after another, but she kept them moving. Finally, they reached the minimum safe distance for a faster-than-light jump. Danny Price activated the engines and reality twisted around them. The Defiance escaped into the void, leaving the swarm behind. In the medical bay, Greg Stone held Ben Cooper's body and felt rage building inside him. Another good person dead because of the swarm. Another friend lost to this endless war. He made a silent promise that Ben's sacrifice would matter. They had the materials to build the Phoenix weapon, and now they would use it to make the enemy pay. The Defiance limped back to New Haven 3 weeks after leaving the neutron star system. The ship was barely functional, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and half its systems offline. But they had succeeded. The Neutronium-9 was secure in shielded containers, and Dr. Lisa Martinez confirmed there was enough to build the Phoenix weapon. Jake Harrison greeted them personally at the docking bay, and when he heard about Ben Cooper's sacrifice, he ordered flags lowered across the colony. Another hero had fallen, but his death had given humanity a fighting chance. 3 months passed and New Haven transformed from a refugee camp into a military stronghold. Word of the successful mission had spread through the scattered survivors, and ships arrived daily, bringing people who wanted to fight. The population grew to 50,000 and a proper fleet assembled in orbit. 15 warships had been gathered from hidden bases and repair facilities. 40 support vessels carried supplies and equipment. Hundreds of fighters were ready for combat. It was still tiny compared to the swarm's forces, but it was an army. Dr. Lisa Martinez led the construction of the Phoenix weapon, working around the clock with a team of engineers and scientists. The device was massive, requiring the combined power output of 3 ships to function. They converted the Defiance, along with 2 other vessels named Liberty and Endeavor, into a linked weapons platform. The technical challenges were enormous because the quantum field manipulation required precise calibration. One mistake and the weapon would tear itself apart, taking the ships and crews with it. Danny Price supervised the engineering work and solved problems that seemed impossible. They needed power conduits that could handle energy levels beyond anything human technology was designed for. They needed quantum processors that could coordinate across 3 separate ships in perfect synchronization. Danny and his team worked miracles using modified reactor cores and experimental computer systems. The work was dangerous and 2 engineers died in accidents, but slowly the weapon took shape. Kate Morrison's intelligence network discovered something that changed everything. Her analysts had been tracking swarm movements and noticed massive resources being diverted to Earth. Enemy ships were arriving by the hundreds, bringing construction materials and equipment. After weeks of observation, Kate determined the swarm was building a superweapon at Earth, using the planet's core as a power source. If completed, it would have enough range to sterilize every remaining human colony simultaneously. Jake Harrison called an emergency council meeting when he learned about the threat. The senior staff gathered in the command center and studied the intelligence reports. Paul Webb estimated they had 6 weeks before the enemy weapon became operational. Lisa Martinez reported that the Phoenix device would not be ready for at least 2 months. They were out of time. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. The discussion that followed was heated and emotional. Some argued they should abandon the offensive and flee deeper into space to buy more time. Others insisted that running was pointless because the swarm would eventually find them, no matter where they hid. Greg Stone stood and declared they should attack now, even if Phoenix was incomplete. At least they would die fighting rather than waiting for extinction. His words resonated with many in the room. Jake Harrison listened to every opinion and then made his decision. They would use an incomplete Phoenix weapon. Lisa Martinez would do her best to stabilize it, but there would be significant risk. Her calculations showed a 60% chance of catastrophic failure that would destroy the fleet. But there was also a 40% chance it would work long enough to disrupt the swarm's hive network. Those odds were terrible, but they were better than waiting to die. The decision required approval from the civilian leadership. Jake Harrison called for a vote among the colony representatives. The debate lasted hours with passionate arguments on both sides. Some speakers talked about responsibility to protect the survivors and preserve humanity for the future. Others spoke about the debt owed to those who had died on Earth and the moral necessity of fighting back. When the vote finally came, it passed by a narrow margin. The offensive was approved. Those who had argued against the plan ultimately accepted the decision and pledged their support. Unity was essential because divided they would certainly fail. Jake Harrison addressed the entire colony over the communication network and explained what was coming. He told them honestly about the risks and the odds. He gave everyone a choice to stay behind if they wished. Almost nobody took that option. They had all lost too much to the swarm and wanted to be part of the fight. The remaining weeks were spent in intensive preparation. Amy Chen trained new pilots using every spare fighter they had. Her students were young and inexperienced, but they learned quickly because they had no other choice. She taught them tactics for fighting against superior numbers and how to exploit the swarm's hive mind weaknesses. She pushed them hard because she knew that in battle, hesitation meant death. Greg Stone drilled his Marines for the ground assault on Earth. The 8 plan called for boarding teams to infiltrate the swarm superweapon and destroy it from within. The training was brutal, with live fire exercises and combat simulations that pushed everyone to their limits. Greg demanded perfection, because anything less would result in failure and extinction. His Marines responded with dedication that bordered on fanaticism. Danny Price and his engineers worked miracles keeping the aging fleet operational. Many of the ships were decades old, with systems held together by improvised repairs. They needed every vessel functional for the battle because there were no reserves. Danny personally inspected each ship and made modifications to increase their survivability. He knew most of these ships would not return from Earth, but he was determined they would fight as long as possible. Lisa Martinez rarely slept during those final weeks. The Phoenix weapon consumed all her attention, as she struggled to stabilize systems that wanted to tear themselves apart. The Neutronium-9 was incredibly volatile, and containing it required constant monitoring. She ran thousands of simulations looking for ways to improve their odds. The numbers refused to get better, but she kept trying because giving up was not an option. Personal moments emerged among the preparations. Jake Harrison recorded a message for his sister, even though he believed she was dead. He talked about their childhood and apologized for not being there when Earth fell. He promised that humanity would survive and remember everyone who had been lost. When he finished recording, he encrypted the file and set it to broadcast if he died. Amy Chen found Greg Stone in the training facility late one night. They sat together in silence for a long time before she finally spoke. She told him she was scared, and he admitted he was too. They talked about what might have been if the swarm had never come, and what Earth had been like before the invasion. They shared a moment of connection and acknowledged feelings neither had expressed before. Then they returned to work because duty demanded it. Kate Morrison spent time with the orphan children from the rescued colonies. She read them stories and played simple games, trying to give them some normalcy. These children had lost everything, but they still laughed and played. She found her own reason to fight in their resilience. If humanity was worth saving, it was because of moments like these. The fleet assembled in orbit around New Haven as Phoenix neared completion. 15 warships formed the battle line with the Valiant at the center. Support vessels carried supplies and reinforcements. Fighter squadrons practiced formations and attack runs. 40,000 souls prepared for the greatest battle humanity had ever faced. They knew most would not survive, but nobody backed down. Lisa Martinez ran the final tests on Phoenix and declared it as ready as it would ever be. The 60% failure rate had not changed, but she had added safety protocols that might contain a catastrophic failure. It was the best she could do with the time available. She informed Jake Harrison that they could proceed. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and looked at his fleet. These ships represented humanity's last hope. Behind him were the survivors, depending on them to succeed. Ahead was Earth and the swarm that had taken everything. He activated the fleet communication network and prepared to give the most important speech of his life. He spoke of what they had lost and what they were fighting for. He reminded them that humans throughout history had faced impossible odds and prevailed through determination and courage. He told them the swarm had made a mistake by underestimating humanity. The aliens thought they could break human spirit, but they were wrong. As long as one person refused to surrender, the fight would continue. His words echoed across 40,000 souls and ignited a fire in their hearts. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed, heading toward Earth for humanity's final battle. There was no turning back now. They would either win and reclaim their home or die trying, but they would face the swarm together as one united species. The stars blurred around them as they raced toward their destiny. The human fleet dropped out of faster than light speed at the edge of the solar system, and every screen filled with enemy contacts. Earth was surrounded by thousands of swarm vessels forming defensive rings around the planet. At the center of it all hung the alien superweapon, a structure the size of a small moon connected to Earth by massive energy beams. The harvesting had already begun, with streamers of glowing matter being pulled from the planet's core. Jake Harrison looked at the display and knew they were facing odds that no military force should accept, but retreat was not an option. Amy Chen launched with her fighter squadron before the capital ships even engaged. 200 fighters accelerated toward the enemy formations with orders to hit the sensor arrays and communication relays. The swarm responded immediately, with thousands of drones rising to meet them. The space between Earth and the fleet filled with weapons fire and explosions. Amy led her pilots through the chaos using every trick she had learned. They flew in unpredictable patterns and struck from unexpected angles. The swarm's perfect coordination worked against them because humans fought with creativity and improvisation. The Valiant and 14 other warships pushed forward into the enemy fleet. Greg Stone watched from the Marine deck as the battle unfolded around them. The human ships were outnumbered 50-1, but they had surprise and desperation on their side. Jake Harrison ordered aggressive tactics, using the swarm's own formations against them. When enemy ships tried to surround the humans, they found themselves caught in crossfire. Explosions blossomed across the battlefield as both sides took losses. Dr. Lisa Martinez was aboard the Defiance, coordinating the Phoenix weapon activation sequence. The 3 ships carrying the device had positioned themselves at the rear of the fleet, protected by layers of defensive vessels. She initiated the startup sequence and watched her screens fill with data. The Neutronium-9 cores began generating the quantum field, and power readings climbed toward dangerous levels. Everything was holding together, but barely. The weapon would need 12 minutes to reach full charge, and during that time they would be completely vulnerable. Jake Harrison received the update from Lisa and knew those 12 minutes would decide humanity's fate. He ordered every available ship to form a protective sphere around the Phoenix platform. The commanders acknowledged without hesitation, knowing they were being asked to die. The human fleet contracted into a tight defensive formation while the swarm sensed weakness and pressed the attack. The battle became a desperate struggle for survival. Enemy ships crashed against the human defensive line in waves that seemed endless. The destroyer Courage took direct hits, protecting the Phoenix platform, and broke apart with all hands lost. The cruiser Defiant held its position even as fires consumed its hull, until a final explosion sent it spinning into the void. One by one, the defending ships were destroyed, but the survivors closed ranks and maintained the perimeter. Amy Chen's fighter squadron had been reduced to 30 craft, but they continued their mission. She led attacks on the swarm command relays, disrupting their coordination and buying precious seconds. Her wingman was hit and spiraled away, trailing debris. She did not have time to grieve because more enemies were incoming. Her weapons were nearly depleted and her shields were failing, but she kept fighting. Greg Stone prepared his Marines for the assault on the superweapon. The plan called for boarding teams to penetrate the structure and destroy it from within, while Phoenix disrupted the swarm network. It was a suicide mission, but every Marine volunteered. They loaded into assault transports and waited for the signal to launch. Greg checked his weapons one last time and thought about all the people they had lost. This was for them. Lisa Martinez watched the countdown with her heart pounding. 10 minutes had passed and the quantum field was approaching critical mass. The Defiance was shaking violently and alarms were screaming, but the systems held. She made constant adjustments to keep everything balanced, knowing that one mistake would kill everyone. Her team worked with frantic precision, making calculations faster than they ever had before. A Nexus command ship broke through the defensive perimeter, heading directly for the Phoenix platform. It was massive and heavily armed with weapons that could destroy all 3 ships in seconds. Jake Harrison tried to intercept, but the Valiant was too far away. Other ships moved to block, but they would not reach it in time. Amy Chen saw what was happening and made her decision without hesitation. Her fighter was damaged and out of ammunition, but she still had one weapon left. Amy accelerated toward the Nexus ship at maximum speed. Her squadron leader screamed for her to break off, but she ignored the order. She thought about Earth and everyone who had died there. She thought about Ben Cooper and all the others who had sacrificed everything. Now it was her turn. She whispered a final goodbye and aimed her fighter at the Nexus ship's bridge. The impact was catastrophic. Amy's fighter punched through the alien hull and detonated her remaining fuel cells inside the command center. The Nexus ship shuddered and its weapons fire ceased. Secondary explosions rippled through its structure as the hive mind connection was severed. The massive vessel began to drift as thousands of drones suddenly lost coordination. Amy Chen died instantly, but her sacrifice bought the time they needed. Lisa Martinez activated Phoenix with 30 seconds remaining on the countdown. The quantum field exploded outward in a wave of invisible energy that swept across the solar system at the speed of light. Every swarm vessel in range was hit simultaneously, and their hive mind network collapsed. Thousands of ships went dark as the connection to their Nexus controllers was severed. For the first time since the invasion, the swarm was vulnerable. Jake Harrison did not waste the opportunity. He ordered the fleet to press the attack while the enemy was disoriented. Human ships surged forward, targeting the disabled swarm vessels. Without coordination, the aliens could not mount an effective defense. Ship after ship was destroyed as the humans fought with savage intensity. This was revenge for Earth and every colony that had fallen. Greg Stone launched his assault on the superweapon while the swarm was confused. The transports dodged disabled enemy vessels and reached the structure's outer hull. Marines breached the alien metal with cutting torches and poured inside. The fighting was brutal in the narrow corridors with hand-to-hand combat against automated defenses. Greg led his team deeper into the structure, following Kate Morrison's intelligence maps toward the core. They reached the power control center after losing half the assault force. The room was vast, filled with alien technology that pulsed with stolen energy from Earth's core. Greg ordered his Marines to plant demolition charges on every critical system. They worked quickly, knowing the swarm might regain control at any moment. When the charges were set, Greg activated the detonation timer and ordered his team to evacuate. The timer malfunctioned. Greg stared at the display and realized it had been damaged during the fighting. Someone would need to trigger the charges manually, which meant staying behind. His Marines refused to leave him, but he ordered them out at gunpoint. This was his choice and his sacrifice. They reluctantly retreated while Greg remained alone in the alien structure. He opened a communication channel to the fleet and spoke his final words. He told Jake Harrison the mission was complete and thanked everyone for the privilege of serving with them. He thought about Amy Chen and Ben Cooper and all the others who had given their lives. Now he would join them. Greg Stone triggered the demolition charges, and the superweapon tore itself apart in a blinding explosion that lit up the solar system. The destruction of the superweapon broke the swarm's assault. With their command network disrupted and their primary objective destroyed, the remaining alien ships began to retreat. The human fleet pursued relentlessly, destroying stragglers and preventing any organized withdrawal. After hours of fighting, the last swarm vessels jumped away, leaving the solar system. Humanity had won, but the cost was staggering. Of the 15 warships, only 5 remained functional. 20,000 people had died in the battle, including Amy Chen and Greg Stone. The survivors were exhausted and grieving, but they had reclaimed Earth. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the damaged Valiant and looked at the planet below. The surface was scarred and the cities were ruins, but it was home. They had survived the swarm's attempt at extinction and proven that humanity could not be broken. Weeks passed as survivors began returning to Earth. The work of rebuilding started immediately, with people clearing rubble and establishing settlements. Dr. Lisa Martinez adapted the Phoenix technology into a defensive network that would prevent the swarm from ever returning. Kate Morrison helped establish a new unified government that represented all surviving colonies. Danny Price led reconstruction efforts using salvaged materials and human ingenuity. Jake Harrison visited the memorial being constructed in what remained of New York. A massive wall was being carved with the names of everyone who had died in the war, billions of names that would take years to complete. He found the sections reserved for Amy Chen and Greg Stone and placed flowers there. They had been heroes in the truest sense, giving everything so others could live. 5 years later, Earth had been transformed.